Coretta Scott was preparing for a career as a singer when she met and married a young Southern preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. As he rose to national prominence as a key figure in the blossoming civil rights movement, his wife was often at his side during marches and demonstrations. Coretta Scott King was also alone with 4 children to raise while her husband traveled for the cause of ending racial segregation in the American South. When she was widowed by the assassination of Dr. King in 1968, Coretta Scott King continued his message of civil rights nonviolent activism and worked to keep his memory and dream alive. This is her story. Coretta Scott was born on a farm in 1927 in Heiberger, Alabama. From the start, it was a hard-working and unpredictable life in the segregated South during the Depression. Young Coretta and her brother and sister had to pick cotton on the farm to help the family make ends meet. Coretta also walked 5 miles a day to attend school as the white children rode the bus. Nevertheless, she was an intelligent and dedicated student, excelled in music, and played both the trumpet and piano. Coretta graduated from Lincoln High School as the class valedictorian in 1945. She followed her older sister to Antioch College in Ohio, where Edith Scott had been the first black student to enroll. At Antioch, Coretta Scott majored in music and education. She also took an active interest in the budding civil rights movement and joined the Antioch chapter of the NAACP and the college's Race Relations and Civil Liberties Committees. Upon graduation in 1951, she decided to pursue a career in music rather than teaching because, unlike white classmates, she was not allowed to student teach in public schools. A gifted classical singer and musician, Coretta received a scholarship to study violin and voice at the New England Conservatory of Music located in Boston, Massachusetts. While she attended the conservatory, Coretta did housekeeping, worked as a mail clerk, and subsisted on meager meals to get by. It was on a chilly winter afternoon in 1952 when Coretta received a phone call from a Boston University doctoral candidate who called himself M.L. King. Coretta's first encounter with the man who would become her husband did not begin favorably. Martin Luther King Jr., a theology student very much in the market for a wife, called her after getting her name from a friend and announced his intent with the opening line,
"You know every Napoleon has his Waterloo. I'm at my Waterloo, and I'm on my knees."
Coretta Scott replied, "That's absurd. You don't even know me."
He said he heard good things about me. Blah, blah, blah. He said I was his Waterloo, and he was on his knees begging to meet me. I called it intellectual jive. I figured lunch would be safe.
Coretta agreed to meet the next day for lunch. In the cafeteria, she was at first unimpressed with Martin Luther King's lack of height. Her opinion quickly changed, however, as the young man's intelligence, conviction, and charm became apparent. Martin was looking for a wife appropriate for one of Atlanta's most prominent ministerial families, and he saw that in Coretta. He loved her long, natural hairstyle and flattered her with compliments. They also recognized in each other a strong sense of social conscience. Before King left that day, he told her he was looking for a woman with character, intelligence, personality, and beauty. Coretta Scott fit the bill. Martin and Coretta were married on June 18, 1953, in a ceremony conducted by the groom's father. The new Mrs. King completed her degree at the New England Conservatory, and the young couple moved in 1954 to Montgomery, Alabama, where Martin Luther King Jr. had accepted an appointment as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. The young couple could not have known that the direction of their lives would be dramatically altered in the year to come, as historic events in Montgomery triggered the modern civil rights movement. When a local seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to yield her seat on a Montgomery city bus to a white passenger, she was arrested for violating the city's ordinances giving white passengers preferential treatment in public transportation. The black citizens of Montgomery organized immediately in defense of Mrs. Parks. Their eloquent new minister was chosen as the spokesperson, largely because of his immaculate background and lovely, talented wife. Under Martin Luther King's leadership, the citizens organized a boycott of the city's buses. The Montgomery bus boycott drew the attention of the world to the continued injustice of segregation in the United States and led to court decisions striking down all local ordinances separating the races in public transit. Dr. King's eloquent advocacy of nonviolent civil disobedience soon made him the most recognizable face of the civil rights movement, and he was called on to lead marches in city after city with Coretta King at his side, inspiring the citizens, black and white, to defy the segregation laws. The visibility of Dr. King's leadership attracted fierce opposition from the supporters of institutionalized racism. Coretta King developed an iron will and a steely resolve to support her husband's commitment to civil rights by answering mail, telephone calls, and occasionally speaking at engagements that he was unable to attend. Coretta's primary focus in the early years of the civil rights movement, however, was her family. In 1955, she gave birth to a baby girl they named Yolanda. 2 months after Yolanda was born, white supremacists bombed the King family home. Coretta was home alone with her daughter when the bomb exploded and was the first to subdue the angry crowd who descended on their house, anxious to retaliate. Coretta would later recall,
I woke up one morning after the bombing and said, "Now I know why we're here."
The Kings had 4 children in all: Yolanda Denise, Martin Luther III, Dexter Scott, and Bernice Albertine. Although the demands of raising a family required Mrs. King to retire from singing, she found another way to put her musical background to the service of the cause. She conceived and performed a series of critically acclaimed freedom concerts, combining poetry, narration, and music to tell the story of the civil rights movement. Over the next few years, Coretta King staged freedom concerts in some of America's most distinguished concert venues as fundraisers for the civil rights organization her husband had founded, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Dr. King's fame soon spread beyond the United States, and he was increasingly seen not only as a leader of the American civil rights movement, but as the symbol of an international struggle for human liberation from racism and other forms of oppression and discrimination. In 1957, Dr. King and Mrs. King traveled to Africa to celebrate the independence of Ghana. In 1959, King resigned as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church to concentrate on his civil rights campaign full-time. They moved to Atlanta to direct the activities of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That year, Martin and Coretta also made a journey to India to honor the memory of Mahatma Gandhi, the inspiration of their philosophy of nonviolence. Dr. King's leadership of the movement for human rights was recognized on the international stage when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Mrs. King accompanied her husband when he traveled to Oslo, Norway to accept the prize. Coretta still often had to struggle to have her voice heard in the movement. Martin Luther King made it clear he expected her to tend to the home. When high-profile administrators visited the Kings, Coretta would serve the coffee and actively participate in the conversation. It was still a very traditional era, and she remained a traditional wife. Although she deferred to her husband in the public eye, she was less content to take the back seat when it came to matters of war and peace. Old friends were not surprised by Coretta's determination to have her voice heard. "She was always more of an activist than Martin," said one. Although people didn't realize it, the action part was always difficult for him. He wanted to preach and reason things out. Coretta wanted to march. Mrs. King strongly influenced her husband's evolving opposition to the Vietnam War. In 1961, she attended a disarmament conference in Geneva, Switzerland, as a member of the group Women Strike for Peace. While her husband diplomatically refrained from publicly attacking the Kennedy and Johnson foreign administration policies in the early 1960s, Coretta King attended several peace rallies and picketed the White House in 1965. As many people who knew them observed, Coretta Scott King was the backbone of Martin Luther King's strength. He in turn described her as a partner in his mission, not just a supportive spouse.
I wish I could say, to satisfy my masculine ego, that I led her down this path. But I must say we went down together, because she was as actively involved and concerned when we met as she is now.
In March of 1968, Martin sent Coretta flowers as he usually did when he traveled. But something was different this time. Instead of fresh, they were made of silk. When Coretta asked him why, her husband told her he wanted her to have something she could keep. 3 weeks later, on the evening of April 4th, 1968, Coretta King had just returned from shopping with Yolanda for Easter dresses when a terrible phone call came from Jesse Jackson, who had accompanied Dr. King to Memphis to support a strike by sanitation workers. Martin had been shot on the balcony of a hotel, he told her, and she needed to go to Memphis immediately. By the time she arrived, her husband had died, killed by an assassin's bullet. Channeling her grief, Mrs. King concentrated her energies on fulfilling her husband's work. The day before her husband's funeral in Atlanta, she flew to Memphis to address the same striking workers he had come to assist. Coretta King led 50,000 marchers through the streets of Memphis and said to them, "I would challenge you today to see that his spirit never dies. We are going to continue his work to make all people truly free." With a deep commitment to preserve King's legacy, Coretta King began to build the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, a living memorial to her husband's life and dream. Years of planning, fundraising, and lobbying lay ahead, but Mrs. King would not be deterred, nor did she neglect involvement in the causes he had championed. In stepping in for her husband after his death, Mrs. King at first used his words as much as possible, as if her goal were simply to maintain his presence, even in death. But soon, she developed her own language and began to champion causes unique to her. A month after her husband's death, Senator Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. He and Ethel Kennedy had attended Martin's funeral, and now the two widows consoled each other in Washington, D.C. Shortly after that, Mrs. King represented her husband at the Poor People's Campaign at the Lincoln Memorial. She spoke not only of his vision, but also of hers, one about gender as well as race, as she called upon American women to unite and form a solid block of women power to fight the three great evils of racism, poverty, and war. Coretta joined the board of directors of the National Organization of Women as well as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and became involved with a wide group of international human rights issues, rather than being focused primarily on race. In Coretta's view, this was completely in keeping with her late husband's vision. In 1969, Coretta wrote the book My Life with Martin Luther King and continued her work with the King Center, addressing social issues she believed caused violence, such as hunger, unemployment, voting rights, and racism. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Coretta King continued to speak publicly and write nationally syndicated columns. In 1983, she led an effort that brought more than 500,000 demonstrators to Washington, D.C. to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. As chairperson of the Martin Luther King Jr. Federal Holiday Commission, Coretta King led the successful campaign to establish Dr. King's birthday, January 15th, as a national holiday. By an act of Congress, the first national observance of the holiday took place in 1986. Mrs. King was invited by President Bill Clinton to witness the historic handshake between Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Chairman Yasser Arafat at the signing of the Middle East Peace Accords in 1993. Mrs. King and 3 of her children were arrested in 1985 at the South African Embassy in Washington, D.C. for their protest against that country's apartheid system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. 10 years after that, she accompanied Nelson Mandela in Johannesburg when he was sworn in as President of South Africa. In 1985, Mrs. King asked Stanford professor Claiborne Carson, a former civil rights activist from Georgia, to direct the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project. Originally initiated by the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, the project became a cooperative venture of Stanford University, the King Center, and the King Estate. Currently part of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute, the King Papers Project's principal mission is to publish a definitive 14-volume edition of King's most significant correspondence, sermons, speeches, published writings, and unpublished manuscripts. The published volumes of the papers of Martin Luther King have already influenced scholarship and become essential reference works. The project also offers unique opportunities for students to become involved in its research through the King Fellowship Program. In recent years, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. has come back under examination. James Earl Ray, the convicted assassin, passed away in 1998, still serving his sentence but declaring his innocence. The King family began publicly expressing doubts that James Earl Ray acted alone. Coretta Scott King and her son Dexter King made an appeal to then Attorney General Janet Reno and President Bill Clinton for a national commission to investigate the assassination. When Reno granted a limited Justice Department review, Coretta King presented a collection of evidence of a multi-level conspiracy to assassinate her husband she had amassed through the years. After a 7-month investigation, a Memphis district attorney concluded that there was no reason to believe that Ray had not committed the crime, and he appeared to have acted alone. The King family, not satisfied with these findings, filed a suit against retired businessman Lloyd Jowers, who said he had been paid to plan the crime. In December 1999, a Tennessee jury extended the circle of responsibility for the assassination beyond the late James Earl Ray and found that the act was a conspiracy and had not been accomplished by a single killer. The King family received some criticism for their vigilance in this belief, and the event is still a matter of controversy. In her own right, Coretta Scott King was one of the most influential African American leaders of our time. She received honorary degrees from over 60 colleges and universities, authored 3 books, and wrote a nationally syndicated column. Mrs. King helped found and served on dozens of organizations, including the Black Leadership Forum, the National Black Coalition for Voter Participation, and the Black Leadership Roundtable. After 27 years at the helm of the King Center, Coretta turned over leadership of the center to her son, Dexter Scott King, who served as chairman, president, and CEO until January 2004. On that date, Mrs. King was named interim chair, and her eldest son, Martin Luther King III, assumed leadership position of president and CEO. In August 2005, Coretta King was hospitalized after suffering a stroke. Initially, she was unable to speak or move her right side. She was released a month later after regaining some of her speech and continued physiotherapy at home. On January 14, 2006, Mrs. King made her last public appearance honoring her husband's memory. 2 weeks later, Coretta Scott King passed away at the age of 78. Her final days spent at a holistic therapy center in Mexico, where she had gone to rest and be with her family. Coretta King's body was returned to Atlanta and carried through the streets on a horse-drawn carriage to the Georgia State Capitol as a crowd of thousands threw roses at the casket. Mrs. King became the first woman and the first black person to lie in honor at the Capitol, once a site of segregation. A lone bagpiper played Amazing Grace as Governor Sonny Perdue and his wife escorted the casket into the State House, a sharp contrast to the official snub given to Martin Luther King Jr. nearly 40 years earlier by segregationist Governor Leslie Maddox. In all, more than 170,000 people paid their respects to the First Lady of the Civil Rights Movement as she lay in state. President George W. Bush opened his State of the Union address the night of January 31, 2006, by paying tribute to Coretta King. On February 6th, Bush issued a proclamation that flags were to be flown at half-staff throughout the day of King's interment, February 7th. At her funeral, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts recalled the telephone call from Coretta to his brother, President John Kennedy, asking for intervention because her husband had been jailed in Alabama on political charges. This was the time when lynching frequently followed the imprisonment of black men, and President Kennedy, through his brother Robert, the Attorney General, answered her rescue plea. Presidents George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter attended the funeral at the New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, where youngest daughter Bernice King is a minister, continuing the family tradition. In 1968, when her father was assassinated, Bernice was 5 years old and photographed lying in her mother's lap during his funeral. Now she was there to eulogize her mother in front of a crowd of more than 14,000 that had gathered to remember and celebrate her life. At the age of 78, Coretta Scott King's role as keeper of her husband's flame had come to an end, and her own flame will be remembered in history.